Today's lecture is on organizational management. This is part 1, and we'll do part 2 next week. Some of the things that we'll be talking about today are the principles and practices kind of behind the idea of organizational management. We'll talk about the idea of who is our stakeholders, overview of policies, procedures, and rules and their differences, the regulating bodies like licensing and other laws that we work within. And then we'll talk about staff workshops as well, and it's the idea of professional development or staff development and how do we support staff with that. So one of the big things that we're going to be talking about is licensing regulations and why they exist. So licensing is really important, obviously, and then the other agencies and other laws that also regulate us or have policies for how we regulate our organizations, because we need to run our programs within this restraints. As much as we would love to get rid of a couple of licensing regulations, we understand that for the most part, they are to keep children safe and healthy while at childcare. Some of them might seem a little bit overboard, but we need to know what they are so that we can run a program that operates within those restraints so that we are meeting the demands of licensing, and then other laws that also manage how we are as business owners. Just kind of the licensing side, which is keeping children healthy and safe, and then there's the laws as well, which is another form of regulations, and that's like having business owner insurance, making sure that if you're making a center, where is it zoned correctly, is it accessible for people with disabilities? So those kind of the law side and the regulation side, and we need to be aware of both in order to make sure that our programs are compliant with those regulations. I did want to bring a little bit of vocabulary in, and this is stakeholders. So a stakeholder in business is this person or group who stands to benefit from an organization. So typically when you hear about like Google going public on the stock market, they have stakeholders, and those stakeholders go to their big board meetings every year, and they hear about the stake of stock that they've owned in an organization and how well it's doing. The same principle also applies to other forms of business, and we are a form of business. We provide childcare for a fee. The state might pay for it, but somebody is still paying us to provide for this. So we are, at the end of the day, a business. So who stands to benefit or to lose from our organization? The first, obviously, is children and families, and children are more apt to lose from this. So if the center is not providing quality education that keeps children healthy and safe, children will lose. The stakeholder, being children, will lose from your organization because they are not getting quality education. Families, if you can't keep your doors open, if you cannot provide quality childcare Monday through Friday from the hours of 8 to 5, then families can't go to work, and they will lose in that way. Same with staff. Staff benefits from having a job, 40 hours a week. We pay you, we pay your taxes. Hopefully it's a nice place to work. You could also lose from it in that if my business goes out of business, you don't have a job anymore and you are laid off. Stakeholders can also be a board, the nonprofit organization that you work for, a governing board. If you're in a corporate program, you're definitely dealing with boards and governing boards. Nonprofits, typically you have a huge amount of people involved in the work that you provide, like from HR to other parts of things like that. So really what this is, and why I bring this up, is that it's definitely a juggling act. And I'm going to talk about that at the conclusion as well, because all the things that I talk about in the next 2 lectures are a lot of organizational things that you have to keep going. So you're juggling a lot of different balls because you need to balance the needs of the variety of the stakeholders. So you need to make sure that your staff is supported so they can provide for educational experiences for children. You need to balance the needs of the families and angry families, or families that are a little bit more at risk or needy or need more time from you. Staff, if you have a lot of staff, you're dealing with staff issues, staff compromises, staff conflicts, team building. So there's a lot of different balancing of everybody's needs, specifically when you're looking at stakeholders. And that's why I bring this up, is when you are a director, people stand to benefit or lose from how you run an organization. So there are real world implications for how well you can lead in your position. And why that is so difficult is that there's a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different needs and a lot of different variety in what people need. So let's talk about the regulating bodies. The first two are community care licensing and then the California Department of Education. If you don't know about licensing, that's an issue. Most people in this class are teachers, are mentor teachers, lead teachers, or directors already. So teachers that are transitioning into getting their site supervisor permit are people that are already in the director position and are adding to their body of knowledge. So you should know what licensing is. Licensing is the regulating body. Community care licensing, they come around, they make sure, either through annual visits or when somebody complains, to make sure that children are being healthy and safe. We talk about mission statements a lot in this class. The mission statement of community care licensing is healthy and safe children, and then older adults that have developmental disabilities who can't take care of themselves. They also do that as well, but we are really concerned with the child care part of that. Then we also have the California Department of Education. So if you are running a state-funded school, then you also need to have an understanding of the California Department of Education's regulations as well. And this more impacts on your daily basis your ratios because they are going to be smaller than the community care licensing where you can have more children. So what are some other regulating bodies that we need to be aware of? So first there's zoning laws, and this is more if you were going to be opening your own program, you need to know about zoning. Is it commercially, and then if you're an FCC provider, where can you have your kids, that type of stuff. Then there's labor laws, which we talked about in our 150 class, like when are there breaks? How long can you work without having a break? When do you get a 30-minute break? When do you get an hour break? When do you get a 5-minute break? When do you get a 10, 15-minute break? All those types of things have to do with the California Department of Labor, and they are very strict about when these types of things happen as well. Also kind of within this umbrella are the ADA laws. So that's the American Disabilities Act, and that's like if you needed to have a ramp put in because your school is not accessible for children or for employees who might have disabilities. It's a big issue in FCC providers, and it's a big issue for small centers that are operating within older buildings. So I worked in a place in Escondido, and I have a former classmate, teacher that I used to work with in the class. So we worked in kind of an old house that then was an dentist office and then was a child care center. And so we actually got a grant from First Five, and they were able to put in a ramp so that we were more ADA compliant, and we got new floors and stuff with that as far as the ADA compliance, so that it was easier to get around the center. And then we had a ramp from each side so that fire zoning laws were being honored, and so were American disabilities as well. And then insurance, like you need to usually pay for building insurance and business insurance as well. So there's all things, if you are a small business owner, these very much apply to you. Even if you are within a nonprofit, you might have a human resources department, or you have a CEO, so that's like or a COO, a chief operating officer. This is their job, but as a site supervisor or a director, even if you're under an umbrella of a larger group, you probably want to know this to make sure that you are not unintentionally violating it, and that could get you in trouble with HR. You will be HR's best friend, and you will be your CEO's best friend if you know a bit about these and you're cognizant of it, and you can obey these regulations as well. Then some more labor laws that we have are OSHA, and this is like occupational health. So like bleach, we really regulate bleach because of OSHA, because it's a toxic chemical. You don't want to make it too strong. You don't want to make it too weak. You want to wear gloves. You want to wear protective equipment. This is all from OSHA to make sure that staff members are taken care of. Their whole mission purpose is to make sure that in the workplace, hazardous materials are taken care of. Then Social Security and taxes and things like that. Most programs, even if you're small, you have some kind of payroll system that you pay into, and they handle this type of thing for you. Because it's really important that the Department of Labor knows that you are setting aside for Social Security and taxes for the employees who work for you. That is your responsibility as an employer. And then there are some children and family laws that we need to be aware of. IDEA is one, and that is for young children like under the age of 3 who have special needs. So it's a developmental thing, so that you provide appropriate education to the best of your ability in your center for any kind of children who have special needs. And then if you're in a school age program, it would be IEPs and IFSTs, things like that, so that you would be providing for a child to the best of your ability and accommodate their needs in the classroom. So that's the idea of the disabilities for children. And then FERPA is just family privacy. So somebody can't just walk in off the street and be like, I need Bob Jones's information about his child. That's none of their business. The only people who can come in and ask information about a children or see files or anything like that is law enforcement if there was a child abuse case. That's the only reason that people could ask about private information concerning our families, and that's why our files are typically kept under lock and key in somebody's office, is that contains personally identifiable information, so things that can be used to steal people's identities. And it's just the privacy that when you go there and you give information to a center, you know that that is not going to be given to anybody else. So that's FERPA. And then mandated reporter, we should all know that we are mandated reporters if you've been working with children at any length of time, and that is, that's a law as well, that if we see something, we're going to say something, and we'll go more into mandated reporter training extensively and kind of how we work with families and children to keep them safe as directors. So how do you work with regulating bodies? And all of those things that I talked about kind of in 5 minutes, like regulating bodies like the Department of Labor and OSHA and things like that, we will talk more about that as the class goes on. So don't fear that I've just unloaded a bunch of information on you. But I am a community college instructor, and my background and my master's and my bachelor's are in child development. They are not in law. So if you are creating policies from the ground up, so if they have not been created, you don't have an employee handbook, you're just starting out on your own, you're either going to want to work with an HR consultant, and there are lots of those, or with a lawyer consultant, something like that, so that you understand the basics of the laws, because now you are a business owner and you need to draft policies that are legally correct. So I can give you some information, I can point you in the right direction, I can tell you what's probably a best practice, but my disclaimer is I am not an HR person and I am not a law person. That is not what I went to school for. I have experience in it, living it, breathing it as a director, but you need to actually speak with somebody as an HR consultant if you are a small business owner who is creating these on your own. And if you are in a nonprofit or at a Head Start and you have people around you who are HR, you should work with them in order to make sure that your program is fulfilling the legal requirements that they're supposed to. So if OSHA was to make a spot visit of your Head Start, would you be compliant? Is your bleach being stored the way it's supposed to? Are all the hazardous chemicals? Is your kitchen up to par? All those types of things. Maybe look at it, and that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make with all these regulating bodies, is we need to take off the idea of us being teachers or doesn't concern us, and we need to start looking at it through the lens of the director. And why do regulating bodies matter, and how can they be used to keep our staff safe and our program running at its optimal level? I think also the best thing to do as well is to attend orientations with licensing. So even if you have, and if you're working as a director, you should have already, but they have them throughout the month, and they have online ones as well. And if you had some extra time, or you were going to be down in San Diego or now up in Riverside, maybe stop in and do another one. Or maybe you've moved jobs, you've done one before, but maybe you've just moved from assistant director to director. So you did it a while ago. It would probably be a good idea to refresh it, because they do change all the time. Licensing regulations are changing all the time. Also, if you go to the community care licensing group, there are policy papers that they release all the time, and they have emails as well. So I get an email from, I think it's Child Care Update, and each month they give me an email about changes to the licensing, or like to remind me, like in June, they always do something on sunscreen and sun care, and how to keep children safe, and what is a child care program's responsibilities with keeping children safe. So I think that's called the Child Care Update, but you can find it through the licensing website. There's also webinars and online programs for state and federal regulations. And I think these are really great. They can be through the infant and toddler program. West Ed does some, or your organization might do it. And as a teacher, you thought, oh, I don't need to care about that. Well, if you're being offered the chance to have a webinar or an online program about Head Start or state-funded programs or California Department of Education or West Ed, if somebody's paying for you to attend them or they are free and this is a goal that you have, I would highly recommend that you sign up for them. It can be a little bit dense like the lectures that I give where it's a lot of information, it's a lot of like really practical stuff like regulated bodies, staff workshops, that type of stuff. But if this is the direction that you're going into, you're going to want to check it out because the more information and more knowledge you have about regulations that affect us, that's going to make you a more effective director. I want to touch on the idea of policy and procedure. So on the left-hand side is policy, and you can see that I did a really great graphic where I added for staff and for parents. So when we're talking, let's say we wrote a policy about developmentally appropriate practice. You could have two. You could have one for parents and one for staff. They might be a little bit different, but it's the same kind of idea of we meet children where they are. We don't treat a 2-year-old like a 5-year-old, you know, all that type of stuff. So you might have it a little bit more child development ease, like we're using our language for our staff, but you also want to have that included in some kind of parent handbook or some kind of parent information pamphlet to let parents know this is what our program does. This is how we treat children. But it's really kind of formal guidance. So it's a policy statement that it talks about our vision and how we are going to get there. So it's widespread. It doesn't change all the time. I mean, developmentally appropriate practice is never going to change, really. We might update it a little bit with, like, if we've gone more Montessori or Waldorf or Reggio or whatever it is, we might change it slightly. But most programs in Southern California are following developmentally appropriate practice. So it's not going to change a lot. It's broad terms like mission statement type level, the what and the why. So why do we provide developmentally appropriate practice, and what is it? So that would be something that would be for staff or for parents, and it answers a lot of operational issues. So we're looking at my mission statement, and then the developmentally appropriate practice meets some of those operational issues of how do I take my vision of how a center should be run, and the policy is going to help me get to that. And so does the procedure. So the procedure breaks it even more into operating practices or standard operating procedures. And they're typically specific. So a procedure, so a policy about developmentally appropriate practice could go to all staff members. If you're in the kitchen, if you clip the grass, that type of stuff. So you know what our program is all about. But the procedures about lesson planning don't need to go to the kitchen staff. They don't care how you lesson plan because it's very specific to a classroom team. Or bottle warming procedures, but just go to your infant room, and it wouldn't go to your school age program because they're not going to warm bottles in their classes. They might want to know about it if they're afloat, but they're not going to be regularly, they shouldn't be making bottles for a school age program. So it's very narrow, and it's going to change as the program changes. And then it states the how, when, and the who for what we already talked about with the policy is the what and the why, and the procedure is the how, when, or who. And it describes the process. And then there's rules. So we have policies, and then we have procedures, and then we have rules. So rules are particular detail about how a procedure gets carried out. So an example of this would be my mission statement. So my mission statement at my program is I provide quality education for children 0 to 3 through a art and project-based research. And I might have a little bit more in my mission statement. These are my key visions of quality education, art, project-based. My policy is, in order to get that, so one of my policies is that teaching staff will engage in 16 hours of additional training provided by the center each year. And that's how I get quality. So quality is something that's kind of nebulous. It's like a cloud. Everybody has a different definition of it. You look at cloud, and many people see different things. For me, quality is professional development. So my teaching staff will engage in 16 hours of additional training that I provide each year. So that's 2 business days. So my procedure would be, and my policy, I'm definitely going to let my parents know about that, and I'm hopefully going to be so on top of it that I know the date. Like, it'll be President's Day, and it'll be Cesar Chavez Day. So those days, the center will be closed to you guys. You cannot drop them off for childcare because we're going to be sitting in a classroom and we're going to be training. So my procedure will be, center will not provide childcare for 2 days, one spring and one in the fall, or something like that, in order to provide trainings for staff. And then the rule, and this would be a management rule, is the days that we are closed, who attends, who pays for it, if there's lunch, that type of stuff. So you can see how it goes all the way from the big mission all the way into the rule. And so sometimes rules can be for management, and sometimes they can be for staff. depending on how the policy and procedures are. So if my policy was for teaching staff, so let's say it's developmentally appropriate practice like I talked about before, then my procedures could be about staff, could be about lesson planning, like how we do lesson planning, a template for lesson planning, an example of lesson planning, and then my rule would be that it's due to me by Friday, no later. So that I can have it so organizationally I'm getting it and I'm approving it before Monday morning. So I hope that's another example that helps you kind of understand how it comes all the way down. So what if things are changing, or just how do you communicate policy, procedures, and rules with staff? Hopefully you have some kind of onboarding system, so new staff have some kind of prescribed way that they learn. And prescribed in this way just means that somebody has kind of thought about it and they are giving unto them information. So probably an employee handbook, some kind of training program, going over policies and procedures, and then probably working with your classroom team to be trained as well. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, but onboarding or thinking about how you teach new staff is something that's really important to directors. And then how do you communicate changes in policy or new implementation? So if there's a big policy change, so let's say you weren't developmentally appropriate. Let's say you were super academic. And it was like Kumon for 1-year-olds. It was like worksheets all day long for little tiny babies. And you've seen the light and you understand that, you know, child development is much more than that, and you want to move towards a project-based approach. Well, how are you going to communicate these changes in policy for staff and for parents? Because this is new. This is a shift. You're writing a new policy. How are you going to communicate this? And I think in the discussion boards last week, we had great discussions about talking with them, emailing with them, staff meetings, staff workshops, things like that. But it can be hard to embrace new things. So it might be a process that happens over a long amount of time as well. And then how does it get implemented as well? Is it like you snap your fingers, Friday you're academic and Monday you're developmentally appropriate? That would probably be really difficult. You're probably going to ease into it. And then once you have changed a policy, how do you supervise implementation on a regular basis? And that might not even be a new policy. This could be ongoing policy. So like regulations about nap times. People always tell me that they get hit on nap time because they don't have the space to have people, for having children be that spread apart in a darkened classroom. So maybe you've come up with a way, and maybe you have them spread all over the classroom. Maybe tables and chairs need to be moved every day. You're going to need to implement this, and your staff is going to implement, and you're going to make sure that they do it. So by spot checking during nap times to make sure that things have been moved so that all the children have enough space in between them, because that's a really easy way for licensing to hit you. So as a director, you're in the classrooms monitoring and supervising to make sure that the policy and the procedure that you've given to them has been implemented. I want to talk about our online assignment before I jump into the next part, which is about professional development and staff development, because it's about staff workshops. So what you're going to do in this week's online assignment is you're going to create an agenda and one handout for staff in an area of your choosing. So it can literally be anything that you know about that you would like to train your staff on. So if you're already a director, think of the staff you already have. If you're a lead teacher, or mentor teacher, think about if you were to become a director, or if your director asked you to lead a workshop, what would be the thing that you could impart with them? Like, what's your wisdom? What's your area of focus? What does everybody know that you like really rock? So it could be bubbles, it could be art, it could be making Play-Doh, lesson planning, clocking in, developmentally appropriate practice. Like, just pick something that you know that you could really communicate to other people. Like that's your focus. So then you're going to create an agenda and a handout for the staff on that area. So as far as the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit more about why we use agendas, but I'll have a template for you to fill out on Canvas. So on the template, I've already created an agenda, and the areas are in red are what you are going to fill out. So the topic, what you want your the people in the workshop to learn, activities and PowerPoints that you might provide. You don't have to make a PowerPoint for me. You don't have to write out the instructions for activity. You just have to tell me what you would provide. And then a handout. So you're going to write out 2 to 3 learning outcomes that you want staff to understand by the end of your agenda. So let's say you picked bubbles. So then you would talk about why are bubbles important, how can bubbles help children learn, and what would be 2 to 3 learning outcomes about bubbles. Like, so how can you implement it in the classroom? Why is it important? That could be 2 learning outcomes from your staff workshop on bubbles. Or you could have, and then you might also want to, and then on your handout, you're going to include a reading and a resource to support their learning. And you can, so like a reading would be like a PDF, and you don't have to print it out. You can just link to it on the handout. So this is a reading on bubbles, and then maybe a resource would be like a really easy bubble solution that you can do in your classroom. So why should we train staff, and why should we involve them? Why am I making you do this online stuff? So staff members who are involved in planning, training, or professional development, staff development, are more likely to understand the policies. They're going to understand why we're doing it, what we're doing it for, and then they're more likely to implement it with the children and the parents. So the more professional development that you give, and the more quality professional development that meets the needs of a lot of different learners, then they're going to understand policies, they're going to buy into it, and they're going to implement it with your children. So you might save yourself some work supervising classrooms and spot checking and monitoring to make things are done if you spend some time kind of front loading this task by giving somebody some professional development, understand why, and maybe they'll buy in and do these rules and procedures in the classroom. Because we know when staff engage in professional development or staff development, then they commit, or for older staff members, they recommit to the goals of the program. So in turn, that will make it more likely that they'll follow through and they'll carry out policies and procedures in the classroom. So here is an agenda. This is, I like this one, it's a staff meeting one, but it would be easily applicable to a staff workshop. But we have time allotted. So if you run through it and you think about all of the things that you are going to be doing for your staff in order to make sure that they learn this, then you will know roughly how long it's going to take. So if you have an hour and a half, don't plan something that's going to take 2 to 3 hours. And if you have 2 to 3 hours, you might need 2 different topics to talk about, because one might only take an hour and the only other one's going to take an hour and a half. Also, by writing out an agenda of what's going to be brought, you're going to understand about materials. You're going to have found the materials or ordered the materials at Amazon. You're going to have created a handout. You're going to have an email to them ahead of time, and you might have activities created as well. When staff meetings and staff workshops have gone poorly for me, it's when I rolled in that day and just kind of, made something up. I can do it, but it's not as engaging as the time when I spent a couple of weeks, half an hour here and there working on something, finalizing my PowerPoint, making sure that I have activities that keep all of my learners engaged. And if there's an action item from a previous meeting, it can also create space for that. So if you're working through something really difficult, so let's say you've just gone to from a private business and now you're accepting monies from the state, so you're now a state-funded program, there might be new regulations that your staff wasn't familiar with. So that might take previous staff meetings or previous staff workshops to kind of work through these new regulations in order to make sure that they buy into the ideas of those regulations and they will implement them in the classroom. So you might need to create space for that. So that may be the first action is we're going to talk about continuity of care or something like that at the very beginning, and then we're going to get into the meat of what and then handouts. So you need to plan to meet the needs of all learners. So we do that really, really well for our children. So we know that they're spatial, they're kinesthetic, they're visual, they're verbal, all of those types of things. So sometimes we forgot that adults and our staff members learn that way as well. And so that's why in the agenda that you're going to be creating, you're going to be giving me an idea that you're going to be doing it by PowerPoint in an activity, and then you're going to give me an idea of an activity that you would provide. You don't have to write out a lot of specifics, but like if you were doing a thing on bubbles, again, in your agenda would be bubble activity with large wands, baby pool, and a net, or whatever you need to make giant bubbles. Something like that, so that you would have an activity that all of the staff could do that would keep them engaged and help them buy into it. A lot of times, especially with preschool teachers, infant toddler teachers, and school age teachers, just basically anybody who works with children, we do need to do hands-on. That if we can look at it, we can feel it, we can touch it, then we'll start to understand this a little bit better. So that's a really great way is by providing information through a handout or maybe a PowerPoint or a Prezi, or just kind of chatting and lecturing with people, and then you do an activity where they can do it hands-on. we found that people learn best that way. And if possible, email or post ahead of time your agenda and your handout, especially if you have a reading that you want them to do previous to that, or items that they need to bring from their classroom so you can talk about it. It also lets them know what to expect, what topics we're working through, so that they can prepare themselves. So some people who have a hard time with change, knowing what's going to be in the staff workshop will help them start to wrap their heads around new regulatory changes or learning about lesson planning, stuff like that. On the left-hand side, I have an image about a staff stress management workshop. That could be something that you would choose, but you couldn't reproduce this handout, obviously. But just talks about what's stress, and then like ideas that they have for somebody who's stressed. So when I'm looking at a handout, you don't have to do graphics. If you are good at that, please do it. And it's just a little bit of information about the topic that you're talking about. So once again, if it was bubbles, it would be like a reading about bubbles. So like linking to a PDF that you have about how cool bubbles are and how you can use them in each area and each domain in the classroom. And then maybe you would also post a recipe for them as a resource. That would be your recipe is a recipe for awesome bubbles that are really easy to make in the classroom. So, but I also wanted to give an example of how other people can use this as well. And then as I kind of wrap this up, it's a juggling act. What I've gone over in a very short amount of time is a lot of information. That's why I've broken it down into 2 weeks and 2 lectures, as I feel like this would have been way too much to talk about in one day. Because as we engage in organizational management, it's rarely organized. It's not orderly, it's not neat, it doesn't follow a step-by-step pattern. It's typically a process of prioritizing the needs of your program while also moving forwards towards your goals. And that's really difficult. You might come in on a Monday morning and you left in a great shape on Friday night and lesson plans were looked at and turned back to classrooms and everything was clean and you're feeling great, and you roll it up on Monday morning and you have an angry parent that you need to talk to. And all of your ideas of, starting your staff workshop PowerPoints have been shot. So really what it is prioritizing the needs of your program while staying cognizant of the fact that you have goals and you have vision and you have things that you need to provide for a variety of stakeholders, and how do you juggle all of their needs in the most effective way in order to be a really effective director. So that was my lecture for this week, but I did want to talk about what we are going to do this week. So the online assignment is that 2-part staff workshop that I just talked about, where you're doing an agenda, on a template that I've already provided for you, and then you're making your own simple handout that reinforces the topic that you've given me for that agenda. So once again, if your agenda was about bubbles, you're giving me the topic, 2 student learning outcomes that they're going to learn, how you're going to provide the information, lectures, PowerPoints, activities, and then in the handout, you're going to talk briefly about bubbles, and then you're going to give me a reading and a resource that reinforce that learning for the staff that you're providing your workshop for. And then the discussion will be whole class, so it won't be in groups this week, and it will talk about the best staff workshop training conference you ever attended and why. It doesn't have to be about childcare, so if you attended something on, I don't know, you went to Comic-Con and Comic-Con was awesome and it was a great riveting speaker, why? Why did that person like grab your soul and just speak to your heart? What makes a really good staff workshop or training or conference or just something where you've learned something new? Tony Robbins. If you went to a Tony Robbins conference or you heard a great pastor at your church, what information did you receive from that person, and why and how did they deliver it, and why was it meaningful to you? And that's why I'm hoping that we can get some ideas from each other so that we can kind of come away from this week with some great ideas in doing staff workshops. So if you heard Tony Robbins, Comic-Con, a pastor, or a West Ed training, or a Head Start trainer came to speak to you, whatever it was, why was it so effective? And give us like specific details so that maybe we can implement this in our own staff workshops. And then the reading, I'm going to cite to an early childhood education, professional development training and technical assistance glossary. I know it's really wordy, but it's from NIAC, and it just talks about professional development programs and how you can implement them. I think it's got some great information. And then I used chapter 5 from the textbook. I'm going to use chapter 5 this week, and next week when talking about organizational management and planning and all those types of things. So if you have the textbook, it would be great if you could look at that chapter. It's going to have more information on stakeholders and the management process. that's it for this lecture this week, and I will see you in the discussion boards.